Hi there, Surge Brake trailer owners. Today we're going to be taking a look and showing you how to install Demco's drum brake easy connect actuator and coupler. These do come in a various different sizes for your ball if you need a bigger or smaller ball, and they also come in various weight ratings. The one we're going to be showing off today is the 2-inch ball and 7K weight rated model. This one is designed to work with drum brakes, but we do offer these also for disc brakes. You do want to make sure you're purchasing the right one because pressures are different between the two, and you want to make sure that it's appropriate for your type of brakes that you're using. We also offer these in different ball sizes for the coupler. The one that we've got on here today that we're showing off is a 2-inch because that's what the trailer came with, so he's using the exact same size to replace it because that's the size ball that our customer had previously, so he wants it to work exactly like it did before. You'll also notice that the actuator, everything kind of stays here on top, and our coupler is down here a little bit lower, so that does help you, does keep our ball more towards the bottom of the frame instead of being on the top of the frame. The mechanism that you see here on top is for your breakaway. This will hook to the back of your vehicle. You may or may not need to extend it if it doesn't reach, but there should be plenty of length there to reach in most cases, because usually your drawbar is not sticking out that far. And this mechanism here, once it pulls, there's a lever here that actually would press inward, and we've got the cover off so you can see the mechanism here. And here you can see that when this, if it were to get pulled, it would push the plunger in, and this little piece here on top would keep this mechanism in the pulled position, so that way the brakes would stay applied even after you had a disconnect. And this actuator does come with the Easy Connect coupler by Demco. What's nice about this is when you drop it down on the ball, you don't even need to open this up. It will automatically open and latch itself automatically right onto the ball. So it's really easy. Just line this up with the ball and just drop it right down on there. Now when you want to disconnect, you will need to get out and manually lift up on the lever to get it to release from your ball. But connecting it is super easy since you don't have to worry about that. And one of the things that surprised me with these actuators is how durable they are. The piece here, even though it is a plastic style piece, is actually extremely strong. I've wailed on these with a hammer before just because Demco told me that I couldn't break it, and they were right. I was unable to break it. And nothing. You would think plastic with, this is probably a 3-pound mallet, or was it 2.5 pounds, what it says down there? I mean, you'd think that would just destroy it, but no. Look at that, not even a mark. And these actuators are going to be upgradable. This style is what you would typically install on a 4-pole connector setup. But if you wanted to have a reverse lockout, you can actually upgrade it. We sell these kits here at eTrailer that gives you an additional plate to cover up the lockout solenoid here, and the lockout solenoid also comes with it, and you would install that in line in between your actuator and your brake lines, and then you could hook up a 5-way flat trailer connector to get a reverse signal to this, so that way when you put your vehicle in reverse, it locks the brakes out from activating. And that's mainly used on these boat trailers here, so that way when you're going to launch your boat into the dock and you're backing down the ramp, your brakes aren't applying as you're trying to back it down in there. So it's a really nice little kit that you can upgrade this with. I do know that if you buy a disc brake version of the actuator, you can get it with this pre-installed, but with the drum brake version here, you would need to add this additional kit. We'll begin our installation here by first removing your old coupler. There's a couple of different ways your coupler could be installed. It could be a weld-on, in which case you would just need to grind the welds to get that off of there. If you're still having difficulty after you've ground the welds down, you can take a chisel on an air hammer, and that usually works pretty well to get that to separate off of there after you've taken most of the welds out. Or it could just be a bolt-on setup. This one was bolted on, so the other one came off pretty easily, just had to remove the bolts. Now our new one here that we're going to install is just going to go right back into place here. Here's our new one. And we can see here that it does have the same bolt pattern that's going to line up for us right in place. So we can bolt this right on. We don't have to do any welding or anything like that. So after we get it sat up there, these two front attachments, you're just going to use regular bolts on the inside, but the rear attachment is very difficult to actually reach that far in to be able to put a nut or anything on it. So we'll be using carriage bolts from the inside and pull them out using a fish wire. So we're going to go ahead and just take one of the bolts though and slide it in here, because it is kind of top heavy. It's going to want to kind of just tip like that. So if we just take a bolt and line it up with our hole there and get it slid into place, just one of them there, that's going to be enough to just keep this on there for you while you're working. So I do recommend though that after you do set it in place there, and just get a bolt to kind of hold it in there, to start with the carriage bolts in the back, because the more hardware you feed into these front ones and bolt down, the less room there's going to be to get those carriage bolts fed in there. For our carriage bolts, this is what we're using here, and all of this hardware is going to be 1/2 inch diameter in size to match up with the holes that we already have there. The spacer that you see here has a square hole. We're going to be using this with it. That'll slide over our carriage bolt, and you can see that the carriage bolt, in order for the bolt to spin, it would have to spin with the spacer, and this spacer is actually going to contact the frame and keep our bolt from spinning, so that way we can thread our nut here on the outside and just run it down without having to reach in there, because again, it's very far back. It'd be difficult to get any kind of tool in there to run a bolt from the outside in or anything like that. So we're going to go ahead and feed these in now. We're going to use some fish wires to do so. Fish wires are usually available without a hitches here at eTrailer, but if you don't have that, you can use some wire, and you can actually just take like a drill bit that's a little smaller than the size bolt you're using, and run some wire around the bit on like the round part of it, not on the spirally part of the bit, and you can make your own fish wire that way. Just kind of run it around it using your drill, holding it tight, and that'll make your coil to thread on there. So we're going to use an old fish wire that we have laying around here. We're just going to use the one, so I'll kind of give you some tricks on how to make sure you can reuse that one multiple times. Take the coiled end here, and you can see this one's been pretty heavily used. It's spread out much further than what we wanted to, but we'll show you here that this is still going to work for us. So even if you're making your own at home and you don't make it very nice, as long as you got a pretty good diameter, even if it's spread out like this, you still should be able to make that work. So go ahead and slide it in there, kind of work it. You might have to tip your actuator up or down and jiggle it just a little bit to get it to fit through. We're then going to bring it to where it comes out the front, and then I like to bend the back of it just to keep that from pulling all the way through. Here we have it coming out the front though, out of the opening that's in the front of our frame. We're going to take our bolt and we're going to thread it into the coiled wire, and since it's all spread out like this, you want to make sure that you're feeding it right into place. So we're looking for where the first thread goes, and we're going to get it started into that first thread, make sure that it's threading around, and we're actually going to be kind of pushing inward and collapsing the spring. I'm pushing the spring and collapsing it as I'm threading it on there to make sure that it threads into each of the spaces in between each thread. We'll now push our carriage bolt with the spacer on it back up into the frame. We can use our fish wire here to help pull it through. Now once you get to this point though, I recommend not pulling it too hard, because especially if it's not the best fish wire, you're going to end up just yanking it off of there, and then you're going to have to feed the bolt back out and start over. So once you get it that far, we're actually going to take like a wrench to help push it, and then you can also use a centering type tool to go into the hole, something that's tapered, to help kind of move this up and down appropriately. So we're going to be using this, it's kind of like a lady foot type tool. You can see the end there's tapered. That'll fit in there nicely, and you can see we can then maneuver our actuator as necessary with that very easily. And we're still going to use the wrench on the other side to help push it and guide it through the hole. And then when you finally get it lined up there, it will just pull right on through. After you got it pulled through, go ahead and take your fish wire off of there. Try to save it if you can, because we want to reuse that on the other side. Also, try not to let the bolt want to push back into the frame. We'll then put a washer and a nylon locking nut on the outside. And we just want it hand tight for now, because when we're feeding in the rest of our bolts, if you tighten this one down, the other ones aren't lined up, you're going to have a difficult time. So we can go ahead and put the other side carriage bolt in, and then after you do that, we can finish up with the rest of our bolts. I'm going to show you one of these over here. This one here I like to leave there just as our kind of safety bolt. Now these lower holes you can see are really close to this flange. So for our washer that we're going to use on the outside, you actually want to cut off the end of it there so that way it will fit properly. That'll slide in there. And on the other side of your bolts, after you slide them in with a washer on them, they're going to get another washer on the inside and a nylon locking nut. Do be careful with these because the spacer that we installed for our carriage bolt, we don't want to pinch the spacer in between this washer and bolt. So you may have to turn that spacer up or down. That's also why you want to kind of leave this loose so you can make that adjustment as necessary. All right, now that we've got each one threaded in with the nut started on all the hardware, we can go back and tighten them down. Our particular hardware we're using here is all going to be 3/4 inch for both the nut and the bolts. I'm going to start with my carriage bolts. We'll get those tightened first. Once we get both of those, you want to double check those lower bolts and make sure that that spacer didn't line up in a way that's going to obstruct it, but we look like we're pretty good there. So then we can take our wrench, we'll go to the inside, hold the nut, and then tighten down the bolt. Now with these ones here, they actually are so close to the bottom that you're likely going to need a thin wall socket and probably even going to have to switch to a wrench to finish it off because it's going to go, once it gets straighter, it's going to pinch your socket down onto the lip there. So we'll start it with that just to take up a larger majority of the threads and save ourselves some time. And we are switching to a thin wall socket to be able to have that kind of clearance. And once you feel it start to bite your socket, you're going to have to pull off of there. So that looks good, and we will finish that up with our wrench. We've got it most of the way tightened down. For these outer ones that are on top, you can go back to your larger socket for those. Now we just need to hook up our brake line and we're ready to go. Now if you're adding this actuator to your setup, we do sell brake line kits available here at eTrailer. We've got flexible line kits, we've got hard line kits and combination kits where you can get pretty much anything that you need to be able to hook these up, as well as drum or disc brake kits. Now this particular actuator is designed for drum brakes, so you would want to use drum brakes on your setup. We do offer this actuator with a disc brake option, but you would want to make sure that you're purchasing it to be specifically for disc brakes because they do have different pressures that they need to operate for those particular styles of brakes. So now we'll hook up our brake line here. Just thread that in place there. And when we go to tighten it down, you want to make sure that you're holding the piece here because this actuator, the master cylinder here, is just made of plastic. So you don't want to tighten this any further than it comes preset. I mean, if you move it just a smidge, it'd probably be okay, but you want to hold that because you can damage the actuator. So hold that and then tighten down your line. And you'll notice when I'm tightening down my line, I'm using a line wrench. You can see there the difference between a standard open end wrench and a line wrench. We've got a lot more surface area there for the line wrench. So we'll get in there now and just finish tightening it down because the fittings here on your lines are going to be made of a softer material. That way they kind of smash into each other to seal up. And then right before we get to the end there, we're going to take our line and we're going to do a counter twist to the direction that we're tightening. That way when we tighten on the line, it doesn't have our line twisted. We'll be twisting it right back into place. So we're going to go ahead and kind of get it a little bit more snug. Make sure we got our little pre-twist in there. And you also want to make sure you're holding this piece and finalize snugging it on down. There we go, and you can see that we've got our line nice and snug. We've got a nice angle going in. It's not twisted or any weird angle. At this point now, our actuator's installed, so you would need to bleed your brakes at this point if you already have brakes and everything set up. If not, you would want to install brakes and run the rest of your lines and all that. And you fill your fluid up here in the top of the reservoir. The cap will come off, and this is where you would fill your fluid. Now you might be wondering, well, hey, how do I bleed these? There's a cap here at the front that we're going to remove. I'm just going to set that back on there because we don't want dirt and debris to get down in there. So we're just going to thread that on there for just a little bit. Make sure you don't cross thread it when you're doing that because again, everything here is plastic. So it is pretty easy to damage it if you're not being careful with it. All right, and now our cover here at the front is actually removable. The cover does have a couple of holes in the sides, and those holes in the sides are just for like quick release little pins. So if you take your screwdriver or an object that fits in there, Just kind of pop that in, pop the other side, and that'll pull right out of there. So that's the plunger that actually goes into the master cylinder or brake actuator there, and you would actually press on this to apply the fluid. And that's kind of how our surge brake setup works. You can see here the coupler is actually on slotted holes. Both this and this are slotted. Don't touch these bolts. They do come at a preset amount that you do not want to adjust to have the right amount of tension where this can still slide, and it's going to press in on that plunger there and activate the brakes. This is also how we're going to bleed it manually when we first get this set up here. So at this point, we've already got our brakes installed. We're going to go ahead and get into bleeding. So this is a drum brake setup here, and you're going to find your bleeder screw on the wheel cylinder where you hooked up your line. It should be right next to it. Now, if you were working on a disc brake setup, I've got a sample caliper here to show you. Typically something like this. And you'll notice on the disc brake setup, this is where the line would enter, and here's the bleeder screws. Now, not all disc brake calipers are going to have 2 bleeder screws, but if they do have 2 bleeder screws, you would always want to use the top bleeder screw when bleeding your brakes. And the size of the bleeder screw can vary. It looks like this is probably 5/16 for this Kodiak caliper. And over on our drum brake here, I know that that's going to be a 3/8 in size. So we're going to be bleeding drum brakes, but again, the procedure's the same. It's just the location of the bleeder that you need to really pay attention to, and always use the top one. With drum brakes, you shouldn't have multiple. There should just be this one. And when I do this, I always want to start at the wheel that is furthest from the actuator. So we're going to go ahead and start on the passenger side rear here. That's typically the furthest one, but it just depends on where your actuator is located, if it's in the center, the left, or the right. So we're going to start on this one though, because this is the typical, usually the furthest rear, and for us it's going to be the furthest to the rear. So now we're going to go ahead and take our little cap off of there. Don't lose your cap. It's nice to have that on there to keep dirt, debris, and stuff from filling up in here and clogging up your bleeder screw for future maintenance and things like that. So we're going to go ahead and loosen this up. Now, we haven't filled it with fluid yet, but we're going to do gravity bleeding first to let nature and gravity kind of do most of the work for us here, minimize how much we have to pump our system. So I'm opening up the bleeder screw, and I went ahead and pulled it open just a couple of threads there. In most cases, you don't need to open it that far when bleeding, but when doing gravity bleeding, a little bit extra opening helps that flow just kind of work naturally better. So you may also want to take a rubber hose and place that on there and bring it down to your pan, because brake fluid can be pretty bad for painted surfaces, wearing off the paint and stuff. So we're going to also grab a little hose and have that go down to our drain pan here just to minimize exposure of brake fluid on our components. All right, we've slid our hose on there to direct it down into either a container or pan. We do have a container that we kind of just rigged up here. This is just an old sports drink bottle, so this works out fairly well for something like this. But again, we got a pan under it here as well, just in case the hose does drip a little bit, we're catching it. So now we're going to head up to our actuator, and we're going to go ahead and fill it up, and then let nature take its course and let gravity do the best it can to start pushing the air from the front back through our lines and out, and getting that fluid there. Now, even though we are going to be gravity bleeding it, you are still going to have to do some pumping. Gravity's not going to do all the work, but it will minimize how much physical labor you have to do. So here we are at the front now. I went ahead and took the cap off of our actuator. If you look at the top here, you'll notice that it tells you what specification of fluid to use. You can use either .3 or 4 fluid in this particular setup. We're going to be using .3 today. But again, you can use either. You do want to make sure that you're using brake fluid from a new container, because brake fluid is hygroscopic, which means it absorbs moisture. So even an open container that's been sitting for a while can actually draw that moisture out of the air. And the more moisture that is in your brake fluid, the lower the boiling point is in the fluid, and we don't want fluid to boil. We're going to be careful not to spill the fluid and go ahead and fill it up. And since we're going to be bleeding it, we're going to get it pretty close to the top, because we are going to be losing fluid as it goes through the system and out towards the container that we have at the back. All right, so we've got it filled up there. We're going to go ahead and let gravity take its course. So you're probably going to see some bubbles there as it starts to make its way through the system. Some of the air is going to come to the top here. Some of the air is going to get pushed back through that open bleeder screw we have towards the rear. We went ahead and let it gravity bleed for a while. We ended up not really getting any fluid out the back. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. Sometimes lifting up the front of the trailer to make it the highest point, which it should already be the highest, but sometimes lifting it up a little higher can help speed up that process or get it started. But in the event that it doesn't, no big deal, you can still pump it manually. So we've got it all topped up here. After you've got it topped up, it is a good idea to put the cap on. In a lot of cases you don't want the cap on when bleeding, but we were trying to minimize how much mess we make here. So keep it from kind of squirting back out of there. Our assistant is gonna push in, and we're gonna be at the back, and we're gonna open up the bleeder screw. So we're gonna go ahead and head to the back now to the wheel, and we'll communicate with our assistant here to press. And what we want to happen is we want our assistant to press it in. We'll open the bleeder screw, let the fluid come out or air, whatever we get out of it. We'll close it. Our assistant will then release, and then he will then press in, and we'll just repeat that process over and over. But we never want to have the bleeder screw in the back open when our assistant is releasing, because that's going to draw air back in our bleeder screw. Go ahead and push it in. Our assistant's going to press. We're going to open, and there's our fluid coming out. I can see a few air bubbles there, so we're going to go ahead and close it back up. Okay, you can go ahead and release. Our assistant's now released. So then what we're going to do is we're going to now have him press it again, and we're going to open it again, and just keep rinsing and repeat until we get a solid stream of fluid out. Every few presses you may want to recheck your reservoir and refill the fluid, because you don't want it to go empty. If it goes empty up there, it's now drawing in air from the front, and we don't want any air in our system. So go ahead and press. There you can see all that air shooting out of there. So we're going to close it. You can go ahead and release. And now that he's released, you can go ahead and press again. And that was a pretty good solid stream we've got there. So we're gonna double check our reservoir, probably hit this one or two more times, then we're gonna head over to the other side and do that one, and you just rinse and repeat for however many wheels that you have until you get a solid stream out of each one. Once you've got everything bled, you can go ahead and reinstall your wheels. If you purchased new drums and hubs from us, they do come with new lug nuts for 1/2-inch studs, so you can utilize those as well. We can go ahead now and tighten them down. The new nuts that it comes with is going to be a 21 millimeter in size. And when tightening them down, you want to do it in a star pattern. This will ensure the wheel draws in evenly, and the tapered side of the nut should face the wheel with the flat side facing outward. And once you get this back on the ground, you'll want to make sure you torque your lug nuts to the manufacturer's specifications. And that completes our look at Demco's Easy Connect drum brake actuator and coupler.